I want to tell you about the day my husband died. Not because it's the most important part of this story, though in some ways it's the seed of everything that came after, but because I need you to understand who I was in that moment. Not strong, not strategic, not the woman who had everything figured out, just a 51-year-old woman sitting in a hospital chair at 2:17 in the morning, holding the hand of the man she had loved for 23 years, watching the monitors go still. The room was very quiet. That's the thing nobody tells you about the moment someone dies in a hospital. You expect noise, alarms, nurses rushing in, the dramatic chaos of a medical emergency. But James had been declining for days, and the nurses had been gentle and honest with us, and by the time it happened, it was just the two of us in a room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and the lavender lotion I had been rubbing on his hands every evening, and the only sound was the soft mechanical hum of equipment that no longer had anything useful to do. I held his hand for a long time after. I don't know exactly how long enough that it had gone cool and the nurse had come in twice to check on me, each time retreating quietly when she saw I wasn't ready. Long enough that the sky outside the window had started to go from black to that particular shade of deep blue that comes just before dawn, that color that has always seemed to me like the world holding its breath before it has to start again. His name was James Arthur Washington, and he was the kind of man who remembered the exact date of your first conversation and brought it up every year like it was a holiday. Not in a performative way, not to impress you or make himself seem romantic, just because he actually remembered, because he paid attention to things that mattered, because that was simply who he was. The kind of man who fixed things, not just around the house, though he did that too, always with that particular focused patience he brought to anything that required his hands, but people. He had this way of sitting with someone who was hurting and just being present in a way that made the hurting a little more bearable, like his presence itself was a kind of medicine. I used to tell him he missed his calling as a pastor. He used to say he had a better gig. He had me. We met when I was 28 years old at a dinner party hosted by mutual friends. I was the one who didn't want to go. It had been a long week. I was tired. I had a novel I was halfway through that I was much more interested in than another evening of making small talk with people I barely knew. My friend Darlene basically dragged me out of my apartment, told me I was becoming a hermit, told me I needed to eat real food and talk to real humans. She was not wrong, and she has never, not once in 23 years, let me forget it. James was standing near the window when I arrived, talking to the host about something. I found out later it was a disagreement about whether the designated hitter rule improved or diminished baseball, a topic James had opinions about that were extensive and deeply held. I noticed him the way you sometimes notice a person before you've met them. Something about the way he stood, easy and unhurried, like he had nowhere else to be and no desire to be there. He had a laugh that arrived without warning, genuine and loud, and it made everyone near him laugh too, even people who hadn't heard the joke. We talked for 4 hours. By the end of the evening, I had missed the last chapter of my novel, and I did not care at all. We had 23 years after that. We had a house in Charlotte that we had turned into a home, room by room, over 2 decades. The living room first, then the kitchen renovation we saved up for 3 years to afford, then the backyard that James made into a garden that was entirely his domain and that I was explicitly forbidden from touching because, as he said with great love and zero apology, I killed everything I planted. I did once try to help with the tomatoes, and I will not go into what happened to them, except to say that James stood in the backyard looking at the results for a long, silent moment, and then turned to me and said, "Baby, I love you. Stay inside." We had Sunday morning pancakes, his recipe, which he guarded like state secrets. We had Friday evening walks through the neighborhood that had started as a health thing and become something else entirely. An hour of just us, talking about everything and nothing, solving the world's problems and leaving them unsolved, watching the neighborhood change around us season by season, year by year. We had a whole language between us made of inside jokes and references and looks across rooms that said everything without a word. The look that meant you're being ridiculous and I love you anyway. The look that meant I'm tired and I need you to cover for me. The look that meant simply, I see you. 23 years is a long time, long enough to build something real. Long enough that the person becomes part of how you understand yourself, part of the infrastructure of your daily life, so woven in that when they're gone, you don't just miss them, you have to learn how to exist in a fundamentally altered world. What we didn't have was enough time. It is never enough time. I know that now in a way I couldn't have known before. The diagnosis came 3 years before he died. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3, aggressive. The doctors were honest with us from the beginning, which I appreciated even when the honesty was unbearable. We sat in that oncologist's office, a small room with a window that looked out on a parking garage, which struck me as an inappropriate view for a room where people receive news like this. And I held James's hand and we listened and we asked questions and we drove home in silence and then sat in the kitchen for a long time before either of us could speak. James spoke first. He said, "Okay, tell me what we need to do." That was who he was, even then, even in that moment. Okay, tell me what we need to do. We did everything they told us to do. The surgeries, the chemotherapy, the clinical trials, the dietary changes, the supplements, the second opinions and third opinions, and the drive to Duke for the specialist who had published research specifically on his type of tumor. We fought hard. James fought harder than anyone I have ever seen fight for anything, and I fought right alongside him every single day for 3 years. I learned to administer his medications. I learned to read his lab results. I learned the names of every drug he was taking and what each one did and what the side effects were and what to watch for. I became, out of necessity and out of love, a different kind of competent than I had ever been before. But some fights you can't win. And on a Tuesday night in March, 3 years and 2 months after that appointment in the small room looking out on the parking garage, the fight ended. I sat with him until the sky started to lighten. Then I called our daughter. I should have mentioned her earlier, Kezia, 26 years old, living in Raleigh, who had been driving down every weekend for months, and who answered the phone on the first ring because she had not been sleeping either, had been waiting for this call the way all of us had been waiting, dreading it, knowing it was coming and being unable to prepare for it no matter how much warning you have. I drove home alone in the early morning. The roads were empty. The city was still asleep. I sat in my driveway for 45 minutes because I couldn't make myself go inside to a house that now had a different weight to it, a different silence. And then I went in and I sat on the edge of our bed and I looked at the side where James had slept for 23 years and I said out loud to nobody, "Okay, now what?" That question, now what, is the thing grief leaves you with. Not the big philosophical now what, though that's there too. The practical now what, the how do I do this, what happens next, who do I call, what do I do with my hands now that there's nothing for them to do. That was the question I was living inside when Diane arrived. James's younger sister, Diana, was 46 years old when he passed, 5 years younger than him, sharp in the way that can go either way, sharp like a useful tool or sharp like something that cuts you before you realize you're bleeding. I had known Diana for the full 23 years of my marriage, which means I had known her since she was 23 years old and fresh out of college and full of opinions about everything, including, occasionally, me. I want to be fair. I genuinely want to be fair about this because the story I'm about to tell you could easily become one where Diana was always the villain and I was always her target, and that's not quite accurate. The truth is more complicated and in some ways more painful because complicated truths always are. Diana and I had never been close. We were cordial, we were civil, we smiled at each other across holiday tables and stood near each other at family events and had perfectly pleasant conversations about nothing in particular. But there had always been something between us that I couldn't name precisely. Not hostility, never anything you could point to and call hostility. Something subtler. A watchfulness on her part that I had always attributed to her personality, her general way of being in the world. Diana was an observer. She watched people. She took notes mentally, cataloged things. I had always thought it was just how she was wired. I understand now that the watching had always had a specific object, that the cataloging was not casual, but I didn't know that for a long time, and in the years before everything happened, I simply accepted the slight distance between us as the way things were, as something that belonged to the particular geometry of families, where not everyone who shares a last name shares a warmth. She called me the morning after James passed. I was sitting in my kitchen, drinking coffee I didn't taste, watching the light change on the backyard garden, thinking about nothing and everything simultaneously the way you do in the early hours of grief when your mind can't quite settle anywhere. My phone rang and I saw it was Diana, and I answered because of course I answered. She had just lost her brother. We were two women in the same loss. Whatever had existed between us before was smaller than this. She was crying when I picked up, not the performed crying I had sometimes heard from people at the hospital, the kind that's more about the crier than the person they're crying for. This was real. Raw and broken, and underneath it her voice was so much like James's voice, the same cadence, the same particular music of it, that it hit me somewhere I wasn't expecting, and I started crying too. We stayed on the phone for almost an hour. We talked about him, specific things, the way he laughed, a particular memory she had from when they were children, something funny he had said to her the last time she visited. That hour on the phone felt in some ways like the most honest thing that ever existed between Diana and me, two people who had loved the same man, missing him together. "I'm coming," she said near the end. "I'm coming tomorrow. Don't try to talk me out of it." I didn't try to talk her out of it. She arrived the next afternoon in her silver Camry, 2 suitcases in the trunk and a casserole dish covered in foil balanced on the passenger seat. She walked through the front door and she put her arms around me in the foyer, and I let myself be held, and I was so gutted and so empty that I didn't ask any questions about how long she planned to stay or what the arrangement was or anything practical at all. I just stood there and let her hold me and let the exhaustion have me for a minute. That was the first decision. I've thought about it many times since. Not with regret exactly. I don't think I could have done differently in that moment. I don't think it would have been human to do differently, but with the clarity of understanding what it opened. The door opened, and I didn't ask any questions about what else might come through it. The first 2 weeks were honestly something I could not have gotten through without help. That's the truth that sits alongside everything else. The thing about Diana is that she was genuinely useful in those early weeks, genuinely present, and the help was real even if the motives turned out to be something other than what they appeared. There is so much to do when someone dies. People don't talk about this enough. The administrative machinery of death, the endless paperwork and phone calls and decisions that have to be made while you're barely functional. Death certificates, you need more copies than you think, and you need them quickly for the bank and the insurance company and the mortgage company and a dozen other institutions that all require original certified copies before they'll talk to you. The funeral home, with its overwhelming array of choices about things you never wanted to think about. notifying people, and there are always more people than you expect, people James had worked with 15 years ago, people from his church, people from his college, people who had known him in some chapter of his life that intersected briefly with yours and who deserved to know. Receiving the people who come to the house, which is its own kind of labor, the emotional work of accepting condolences, of saying thank you, and yes, we're managing, and he was such a good man, over and over, while casserole dishes accumulate on every flat surface in your kitchen. Diana handled a lot of it. She was good on the phone, clear, organized, able to have practical conversations that I couldn't manage with my voice breaking. She coordinated with the funeral home, communicating back and forth about details that I approved but couldn't negotiate myself. She kept a list of who had brought food and what it was so I could send thank you notes later. She made sure I ate something at regular intervals and went to bed at a reasonable hour and drank water, the basic maintenance of a body that I was not paying much attention to. For 2 weeks, she was exactly what she presented herself as, a devoted sister doing what family does. The funeral was on a Saturday, 9 days after James passed. The church was full, about 200 people, maybe a few more, which told you something about who James was and how widely he had touched people's lives. Kezia read a poem. James's best friend from college gave a eulogy that made everyone laugh and then made everyone cry. I sat in the front pew and held Kezia's hand and held myself together with a focus that was almost athletic. Afterwards, at the house, there were more people and more food and more conversations. I moved through it in a state that was somewhere between present and dissociated. I was there, I was saying the right things, but some part of me was already somewhere else, already sitting in the quiet that was going to come when everyone left. It came eventually. The last car pulled out of the driveway around 7 in the evening. Diana was in the kitchen, quietly washing dishes, and I was sitting in James's chair in the living room, the one he had claimed the first year we moved in and never relinquished, a big, comfortable thing in dark brown leather that had molded itself to him over the years. I sat in it and I let go of everything I had been holding all day, just fell apart completely, quietly, in the way you can only do when you're alone and no one needs you to hold it together anymore. Diana came in at some point. She didn't say anything. She just sat down on the floor right beside the chair, not on the sofa, not on the ottoman, on the floor, like a child would sit, and she stayed there. No words, no comfort noises, no reaching for my hand, just present, just there, being a body in the room, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone. When I was done, she said, "You don't have to do anything tonight. Everything else can wait." She said it quietly, without drama, like it was simply true, and in that moment it was. Everything else could wait. I believed her. She stayed in the guest room that first week, which made practical sense. Kezia was in her old room. I was grateful not to be alone in the house, and Diana was helpful in the morning and in the evening and available during the day. The first week became 2 weeks naturally, easily, the way things do when no one sets a clear end date. 2 weeks became a month. By the time a month had passed, it had simply become the arrangement, the way the household worked, and I had stopped thinking about when it would end because there was so much else to think about. She was between apartments, she explained. The sublease on her place in Raleigh had ended earlier than expected, and she hadn't found anything new yet. The timing was difficult, and it made sense, didn't it, for her to be here while we sorted through the estate? She could help with paperwork, with phone calls, with the 100 small logistical things that needed doing. It would be good for both of us not to be alone. I said, okay. The door opened a little wider. I should tell you about what James and I had built because understanding it matters for understanding everything that came after. We were not wealthy people. I want to be clear about that. We were comfortable, solidly, genuinely comfortable, the result of 2 professional careers and 23 years of careful, intentional financial management, but we were not rich. James had worked in commercial real estate for most of his career, and I had spent 20 years in hospital administration, working my way up to Director of Patient Financial Services at a hospital in Charlotte. Between us, we had built what I would call a real life, not extravagant, but solid. We owned our home outright. That was the thing I was most proud of. We had made the final mortgage payment 4 years before James died, and I remember that evening so clearly. We had a bottle of champagne we'd been saving, nothing fancy, a mid-range bottle we'd bought on a whim and kept in the back of the refrigerator for a special occasion. We sat on the back porch with our glasses, and James made a small toast. Just the 2 of us, the garden around us in the early September dark, and he said, "This is ours." Just that. This is ours. We had retirement accounts, IRAs and 401ks that we'd contributed to consistently for decades that had grown into something meaningful. We had a joint savings account with a balance that could handle emergencies and then some. We had 2 cars, both paid for, and James had maintained a life insurance policy, a term life policy he had taken out 20 years earlier when Kezia was born, with a payout that was, in the context of our lives, significant. Not change your entire life significant, but enough to make a real difference, enough to ensure that I would be genuinely secure for a long time. The will, the one I knew about, the one James and I had sat down and carefully constructed together 8 years before James died, with an estate attorney named Robert Caldwell, who came highly recommended by a colleague, left everything to me. The house, the retirement accounts, the savings, the insurance proceeds. We had talked about it the way we talked about all the serious things in our life, directly, without flinching, with the particular honesty that comes from loving someone enough to say the hard things out loud. James had been clear. He wanted me taken care of. He wanted everything we'd built to stay with me. That was the will on file with Robert Caldwell's office. That was the document that governed what happened to everything James and I made together. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't find out for another 4 months, was that there was a second will, a newer one I had never seen, never discussed, never agreed to. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The first meeting with Robert Caldwell happened about 6 weeks after James passed. I had called his office myself, given them James's name, explained that I was the surviving spouse and needed to begin the probate process. Standard, routine. Robert had handled our estate planning for years, and it felt natural to go back to him, to sit across from someone who knew James, who had been part of how we'd planned for this. Diana asked to come. She framed it as support. She didn't want me to have to navigate something so significant alone. She wanted to be there in case I needed anything. It would be good to have another set of ears. It all made complete sense. I said yes without thinking twice. Robert Caldwell's office was in a building downtown, all dark wood and leather and the particular hush of a place where serious things happen. His assistant brought us water without being asked. Robert himself came out to meet us in the lobby, silver-haired and reassuring in the way of people who have spent decades managing other people's worst moments. He shook my hand warmly. "Renee," he said, "I'm so sorry. James was a remarkable man." Then he turned to Diana. "Ms. Washington," he said, "good to see you again." Not good to meet you, good to see you again, with a familiarity in his tone, a comfort, the ease of someone greeting a person they already know. I noticed it, in the middle of everything, in the fog of grief and the unreality of being there at all. I noticed it. It registered as something slightly wrong, slightly off, a small note of discord in a conversation that should have been entirely expected. I filed it away without fully understanding. I told myself I was tired. I was always tired in those months. I wrote it off. I should have trusted the feeling. The first thing I can point to now, the first concrete, specific, undeniable thing that told me something was wrong, happened about 2 months after James passed, on a Wednesday afternoon when I was going through the filing cabinet in his home office. James's home office was the room in our house that was most completely his. The rest of the house we had made together, piece by piece, decision by decision, but the office was James, his bookshelves, his desk, his particular system of organization that made complete sense once he explained it and would have been incomprehensible to anyone else. He kept hard copies of important documents there, organized in a system of labeled folders in a 2-drawer filing cabinet beside the desk. Tax returns going back 15 years, insurance policies, the mortgage payoff certificate, our wills, or what I believed were our wills. I was going through it methodically, making a list of documents I'd need for the estate process, opening each folder, checking the contents, noting what was there and what condition it was in. I opened the drawer where I knew James kept the insurance documents, and I found the file. It was there, nothing was missing, but the papers inside were out of order. Not dramatically, not like someone had gone through them in a hurry, subtly. Carefully, like someone who had taken the documents out and replaced them with some attention to putting them back, but not quite right. One page slightly askew, the order of documents not matching the order I had seen them in before. James was meticulous. I cannot stress this enough. James organized his files with a precision that was entirely characteristic of him. Things in chronological order, consistently, the same system applied to every folder. I had seen these documents before, multiple times over the years, and I knew how he kept them. Someone had been in this drawer. I stood there for a moment, completely still, and made myself think clearly. Then I went to find Diana. She was in the kitchen, on her laptop, a cup of tea at her elbow. She looked up when I came in with her usual warm, easy expression, nothing guarded, nothing defensive, nothing that you would have been able to point to. "Have you been in James's office?" I asked. My voice was entirely neutral. I had made a decision in the few seconds between the filing cabinet and the kitchen to keep it neutral. "Oh, yes," she said without missing a beat. "I was looking for the car insurance information. James's registration is coming up for renewal, and I wanted to make sure it got handled. I should have said something. I hope that's okay." It was completely plausible. The car insurance was in that general area of the filing cabinet. The registration renewal was a legitimate thing. She'd offered it easily, without the slight over-explanation that sometimes signals a lie. I had nothing concrete to refute it. "Next time, just let me know," I said. "Of course. I'm sorry." Warm, immediate, undefensive. I went back to the office. I went through every drawer, every folder, systematically and completely. I photographed how everything was organized. I made a detailed inventory, and then I took the documents that mattered most, the original will, the insurance policies, the financial account information, and I moved them to a metal lockbox in my bedroom closet that James had used for our passports and Kezia's birth certificate and other documents too important to live in an ordinary folder. I had the only key. I told myself I was just being organized, just being careful, just doing what any responsible person would do when managing an estate. But something had changed. Something had settled in my chest, quiet and hard and watchful, that hadn't been there before. The beginning of knowing, even if I wasn't ready to name what I was beginning to know. My neighbor Karen was the one who finally gave me the piece I needed to put it together. Karen Morrison had lived 2 houses down from us for 11 years. We were the kind of neighbors who had graduated from occasional waves to genuine friendship over the years, swapping plants, sharing recipes, talking over the fence about nothing in particular, occasionally having each other over for dinner. She had known James. She had come to the funeral and brought food afterward, and the food she brought was thoughtful in a way I noticed even through the grief, things that actually kept, things I could eat gradually over days rather than things that would go bad and make me feel guilty. That kind of practical thoughtfulness is rare, and I appreciated it. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon about 10 weeks after James passed. Just checking in, she said, the way Karen did. She had been consistent about reaching out, never intrusive, just steady. We talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular, and then she paused and said, "Can I ask you something? Please tell me if it's none of your business." I said, "You can ask." "I've been seeing Diana's car at the house a few times when your car isn't there, during the day when I assume you're at work, once last week and once the week before." A pause. "I wasn't sure if you knew or if it was something you'd arranged, and I just felt like you should know either way." I kept my voice completely even. "I appreciate you telling me. Yes, I knew." I did not know, but Karen didn't need to know that yet. That evening, I asked Diana in the most casual possible way whether she'd been at the house the previous week while I was at work. She said yes, she'd been working remotely and had just found it easier to be there than to work from a coffee shop. The week before, the same. All perfectly reasonable. "Of course," I said. "Makes sense." She smiled and went back to whatever she was doing, and I sat across from her at the kitchen table and looked at my phone and thought about Karen's phone call and the filing cabinet and Robert Caldwell's too familiar greeting and Diana's specific targeted questions about insurance policies and retirement accounts and deed transfers. And then I went to the kitchen counter and I found a notepad and I sat down and I wrote it all out. Every incident, every observation, in order with dates where I had them. The greeting at the attorney's office, the disturbed files, the visits to the house when I wasn't there, the questions that seemed helpful in the moment and now seemed something else entirely. The account documents she had offered to organize for me in the first weeks, which I had let her do, which I now realized meant that she had had unrestricted access to a complete picture of our financial situation. The list was longer than I expected. At the bottom of the page, I wrote, in letters I pressed hard enough to leave an impression, "Why?" I sat with that question for 3 days, and then I found the answer. It was a Friday afternoon, 3 days after I made the list, and I was looking for a tax document, James's most recent federal return, which I needed for the estate process. I had checked the filing cabinet and hadn't found it in the right place. Diana had organized the financial documents into accordion folders early on, during the first weeks when she had been helping with everything, and I had been too overwhelmed to track exactly what was going where. The folders were in the office closet. I pulled them out one by one, going through each section. The document I needed wasn't where I expected. I found it eventually, in the third folder, misfiled under insurance instead of tax, the kind of misfiling that happens when someone is moving through papers quickly, not carefully. I pulled the tax return out, and as I did, a second document came with it. It had been tucked directly behind the return, slightly larger, folded once along its width. I unfolded it on James's desk. It was a will. James Arthur Washington's last will. Testament, dated 11 months before he died, signed, witnessed, notarized. Not the will I knew, not the document James and I sat down and carefully constructed together, the one that said everything to me and only to me. A different will, a new one. I sat down in James's desk chair. I read it all the way through. Then I read it again. Then I set it flat on the desk and I looked at it for a long time. The house remained mine, sole ownership, no question, that was the same. but the life insurance proceeds, 60% to me, 40% to Diana. The retirement accounts, 60% to me, 40% to Diana. The joint savings account, 60% to me, 40% to Diana. The investment accounts, the vehicles, the personal property, same split, 60-40 across everything. 40% of everything James and I had built across 23 years to his sister, to Diana. I did the math immediately without having to think about it because I knew James's medical history the way I knew my own. It meant this had been signed during a period when James had been on his highest level of pain medication, a period when his oncologist had noted in the records I had copies of that his cognitive clarity was inconsistent, a period when there had been days he didn't know what day it was, days he confused me with his mother, days he couldn't complete a sentence. The notary's signature at the bottom of the last page, Robert Caldwell. I sat in that chair for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the desk. The garden outside the window was doing what it did in late spring, filling in, greening up. The tomato plants James had put in the previous fall as seedlings, growing taller than they had any right to. Then I stood up. I took the will, I went to the lockbox in my bedroom closet, I put it inside with the original will and the insurance documents and the financial account information. I locked it. I put the key in my pocket. I went to the bathroom. I turned on the cold water and I held my wrists under it for a minute. Then I dried my hands and I looked at myself in the mirror and I said, quietly, out loud, "Okay, now I know what I'm dealing with. Now I know what to do." The thing about being blindsided by betrayal, real, deep, calculated betrayal from someone who has been in your house and at your table and sitting on your floor while you cried, is that it does one of two things to you. It breaks you open and sends you into a spiral of anger and reactivity and pain that makes you do things you regret later, things that hurt your own position and give the other person ammunition, or it makes you very still, very clear. Like the grief and the shock and all the noise of feeling burn away, and what's left underneath is just focus, pure, clean, cold focus on exactly what needs to happen next. I went still. I have always been someone who does better under pressure when the pressure is concrete, when the thing I'm facing is specific and has specific solutions and requires specific action. The open-ended grief of losing James had been undoing me slowly for months, not because I couldn't cope with grief, but because grief doesn't have a target, doesn't have a next step, doesn't have anything you can do about it. This was different. This had a shape. This required action. I did not confront Diana. I did not call Robert Caldwell. I did not do anything that would signal to anyone that I had found anything. I went back into the kitchen where Diana was making dinner, and I sat at the table and I talked about what we were having and whether there was enough bread and what was happening in the neighborhood, and I was so entirely normal that I actually impressed myself. The first call I made was to my friend Paulette on Saturday morning while Diana was at a yoga class. Paulette Simmons. I had known her for 16 years, since we had served on a hospital board together. She was an attorney, trusts and estates specifically, practice-based in Charlotte, sharp and clear-headed, and not someone who minced words. I had thought about calling her in the early weeks after James died, but Diana's smooth management of the estate process had made it seem unnecessary. Now it was necessary. I called her from my car in the driveway, not the house where Diana might come home early, where there were no guaranteed private spaces. I told Paulette everything, in order, without embellishment. The new will, The date, James's documented cognitive state during that period, Robert Caldwell's greeting, the disturbed filing cabinet, Karen's observation about the visits to the house, the organized financial documents. Paulette listened without interrupting. When she finished, she was quiet for about 10 seconds. Then, "Okay. First question, has this will been filed anywhere? Do you know if it's entered the probate process yet?" "I don't know. I only just found it." "Okay. Second question, is this the only copy you've seen?" "Yes." "Good. Here's what you're going to do." Her voice was steady and specific in the way I needed it to be. "You need your own attorney, not Robert Caldwell, not anyone Diana has been in contact with. A completely fresh attorney who represents only you. I'm going to give you a name. You call her Monday morning." "Okay." "Second, you don't move anything, you don't change anything, you act exactly as you have been. Diana doesn't find out that you've found that document. Your biggest advantage right now is that she doesn't know you know. The moment she knows, she'll move. She'll accelerate whatever she's been planning. You need to be ahead of her before that happens." "I understand." Third thing, think carefully about anyone in James's life who was present during that period, anyone who might have observed his condition, his cognitive state, anyone who might be willing to speak to it. I thought, and then I remembered. Dr. Patricia Miles, James's oncologist, a woman I had come to know over 3 years of appointments and crises and conversations about hard things, a woman I respected enormously. About 3 weeks before James died, during his last hospitalization, she had come into the room while Diana was there and had asked Diana very politely and very firmly if she could have a few minutes privately with James and his wife, just the immediate family. The way she said it was unmistakable. She meant me. Diana had left. I had watched her face as she did, and I had seen something there that I didn't know what to do with at the time. Something controlled and careful, a face being managed. What Dr. Miles had said to me after Diana left was this. She wanted me to know that James had expressed concerns to her in one of his more lucid periods about things he felt had happened when he wasn't fully himself, things he had signed or agreed to he didn't fully remember or understand when he came back to clarity. She was careful, she was bound by professional limits on what she could say, but she was clear that if I ever had questions about his condition during specific periods of his treatment, she was available to speak with me. I filed that conversation away. I had been too deep in the ending of James's life to process what she was telling me. Now I understood it completely. I told Paulette. She said, "Call her first thing Monday and then call me back." Vivian Cross had been practicing trusts and estates litigation for 22 years. She was in her early 50s, natural gray in her locks, with an office full of plants and a manner that was direct without being harsh, the manner of someone who had sat across from grieving people enough to know how to be honest with them without being cruel about it. I brought everything to our first meeting, the original will, the new will, every financial document I had been able to gather, the log I had been keeping since the night I made the list, every incident, every observation, every date I could pin down, the photos from the filing cabinet, my notes from the conversation with Paulette. Vivian went through it all without rushing. She asked questions as she read, precise, specific questions that told me she understood exactly what she was looking at. When she was done, she set everything on the desk in front of her and looked at me. "Tell me about the notary," she asked. I told her about Robert Caldwell, everything, the original will, his greeting of Diana at our first meeting, the questions Diana had asked and the way he had answered them, the deference I had noticed. An estate attorney who notarizes a will executed by a client during a period of documented cognitive impairment without the knowledge of the surviving spouse after having had undisclosed meetings with a beneficiary of that will, she said and paused. That's a significant exposure for him. What does that mean for me? It means, she said, that this will has serious vulnerabilities. The first and strongest is testamentary capacity, whether James was legally capable of executing a valid will when this was signed, given his documented medical condition during that period. The second is undue influence, whether someone exploited his vulnerability to engineer a change in his estate plan that he would not have made freely and competently. She looked at me steadily. With Dr. Miles's documentation and testimony, with James's medical records, and with what appears to be a pattern of conduct on Diana's part going back months, you have a strong case on both grounds. How strong? Strong enough, she said, that the opposition will likely want to settle rather than litigate. I said, I don't want to settle. I want it on record. I want everything documented and decided by a court. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, then let's build a record they can't argue with. For 6 weeks after that meeting, I lived a double life that cost me more than I can fully describe. During the day, I was the same person Diana had been living with for months. I made coffee in the morning. I asked about her job search. I made dinner sometimes and let her make it other times. I sat across the table from her and talked about ordinary things, the neighborhood, Keziah, a show we were both watching, and I kept my face exactly as it had always been, warm enough to be normal, nothing tighter or more guarded than the grief could explain. No tells. What it cost was something I don't have a name for. Every morning I woke up knowing what I knew and had to choose deliberately and consciously to keep that knowledge out of my face for another day. It was the most sustained act of self-control I have ever performed, and I performed it because Vivian had been clear. The element of surprise was essential. Diana needed to believe she was still ahead of this. The moment she knew I knew, she would move. Meanwhile, Vivian was building. The probate court records confirmed that the new will had not been formally submitted for probate. It was in Robert Caldwell's office files, waiting. Diana had been patient, waiting, Vivian believed, for the grief to soften me enough, for enough time to pass that a newly surfacing will would seem less suspicious, for a moment when she could introduce it into the process without triggering scrutiny. Dr. Patricia Miles provided a detailed statement about James's cognitive condition during the period when the will had been signed. The medical records supported her account completely. James had been in a period of significant, documented cognitive impairment. He had been confused about time and place. He had misidentified people. He had signed things in that period that he later, in his clearer moments, expressed confusion about. Dr. Miles had been specific and she had been thorough, and her statement was, Vivian told me, exactly what we needed. Vivian's investigator found the calendar entries, 4 meetings between Robert Caldwell and Diana in the year before James died, not with James, just Diana, meetings not reflected in James's client file, but documented in Caldwell's calendar, which became available through the discovery process. 4 meetings over the course of a year, building something. And then there was the account. A joint account in James's name and Diana's name opened 14 months before he died. A small balance, about $8,000, but the account itself was the thing. James's name and Diana's name on an account that I had never known existed, opened during a period when James's medical records showed reduced cognitive clarity, an account Diana had apparently convinced him to open without my knowledge as a step in whatever architecture she had been constructing. Vivian presented it all to me during our 6th weekly call. This level of planning over this length of time isn't impulsive. This person has been working toward this for years, possibly since before James got sick. I said, I know. A pause. Are you okay? I thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. I'm not okay, but I'm focused. Right now, that's enough. I chose a Tuesday, no particular reason, just that by that Tuesday, everything was in place and I had been living with the knowledge for 6 weeks and the weight of it had become something I needed to put down. I made chicken and rice for dinner, simple, something I could cook without paying much attention. I set the table, I sat across from Diana, and I let her serve herself and take a few bites and be entirely settled before I said anything. Then I said, I found the will. The change was immediate and total, and she couldn't quite stop it in time. Her fork went still, her eyes went to mine, and in the half-second before she composed her face, before the warm, practiced expression came back, I saw something there that I had never seen before. Not guilt, something older and harder than guilt. The face of someone who has been doing a calculation and has just found an unexpected variable. What will? She said. The one dated 11 months before James died, the one Robert Caldwell notarized, the one that gives you 40% of everything James and I spent 23 years building, the one that was signed when James was on enough medication that his oncologist has documented periods where he couldn't reliably identify what year it was. She set her fork down, very carefully. The deliberateness of the motion told me she was managing herself, working to stay ahead of this. Renee, I'm not here to have a conversation. I'm here to tell you what has already happened and what is going to happen next. My attorney filed a formal notice of intent to contest that will 3 days ago on grounds of lack of testamentary capacity and undue influence. A complaint has been filed with the state bar regarding Robert Caldwell's conduct. The probate court has been notified that the original will is the operative document pending full legal resolution. I paused. And you have until Friday to remove your belongings from my house. She stared at me. I held her gaze, and I did not look away, and I did not raise my voice, and I did not feel anything in particular except the specific clarity that comes from finally saying out loud what you have known for weeks. You don't understand what you're doing, she said, and the warmth was gone from her voice now, stripped away, the flat, hard thing underneath showing through. James, I said, was not competent to want anything in the legally meaningful sense when that document was signed. His medical oncologist will testify to that. His medical records document it. 4 witnesses to his condition during that period are prepared to say so under oath. She was quiet. I also have records of your 4 private meetings with Robert Caldwell over the year before James died, and the joint account in your name and his that you had opened without my knowledge, and the visits to this house while I was at work, and the financial documents you organized for me in the first weeks, which gave you a complete picture of everything we had. I stopped. Did I miss anything? The silence in that kitchen was the most complete silence I have ever sat in. Then Diana said, quietly and without any of the warmth she had been wearing for 6 months, I was protecting what should rightfully stay with the family. I am his family. I have been his family for 23 years. That's not a metaphor. It is a legal and factual statement. You were his sister. There is a difference. I stood up. I pushed my chair back and I stood up, and I looked at her one last time, this woman I had known for 23 years, This woman whose voice sounded like her brother's when she cried. This woman who had sat on the floor of my living room and stayed with me while I fell apart. And I said nothing else. I walked to the bedroom. I closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet. And I breathed. Diana was out of the house by Thursday evening. I came home from work and found her key on the kitchen counter and the guest room stripped of her things. She left no note. I didn't expect one. What followed was about 5 months of legal process, and I'm going to give you the substance of it because it matters. Robert Caldwell cooperated fully once Vivian made clear the extent of the documentation against him. His cooperation was comprehensive, a full written account in detail of how Diana had approached him, over what period of time, with what request, and how he had agreed to help her. The account confirmed everything and added details Vivian hadn't yet established. Robert Caldwell's written account was entered into evidence. Vivian presented the 4 meanings, the joint account, the pattern of conduct over more than a year. The judge's ruling was unambiguous. The will had been executed under circumstances that did not reflect James Washington's free and competent expression of his wishes. It was invalidated. The original will, the one James and I had made together 8 years ago in an afternoon meeting with an attorney who had not yet been corrupted, governed the estate. Everything came to me: the house, the retirement accounts, the savings, the insurance proceeds, everything James and I had built together, intact and protected, the way he had always intended. Diana was ordered to close the joint account and return the full balance to the estate. She was ordered to pay a portion of the legal costs. The Washington family found out through the public court record. I didn't need to tell them. The record told them. And the response was what it was. Several of James's cousins called me. Several of his aunts. His college roommate, who had given the eulogy, left a voicemail that I have listened to more than once. Several of them have not spoken to Diana since. I didn't celebrate any of this. I want to be clear about that. A family fracture is not a victory. It's a loss on top of a loss, and James would have been sad about it, and I am sad about it, in the way you can be sad about something and also understand that you did not cause it and could not have prevented it. Diana caused it. The truth caused it. All I did was let the truth become visible. The garden came back that spring. I hadn't touched it all winter, couldn't bring myself to. It felt like the last thing that was entirely his, and I wasn't ready to disturb that. I let it go dormant, and I walked past it every day, and sometimes I stood at the back window and looked at it and thought about him. In April, James's cousin Raymond came to visit. Raymond had grown up gardening with James. They had been close since childhood, the kind of cousins who were more like brothers, and he spent a Saturday afternoon walking me through the whole garden: what was what needed what, when to water, what to do with the beds James had prepared in the fall. He was patient and specific, and he had James's same way of talking about plants, the same particular attention and care. It was painful to listen to, and also wonderful, the way things that remind you of someone you've lost are both at once. I killed 3 things that summer. I am not going to pretend otherwise. 3 plants that did not survive my learning curve and that James would have found predictable and not at all surprising. But the tomatoes. Raymond had said one particular plant was especially hardy, had been James's favorite variety, would come back even with imperfect care. He was right. 6 tomatoes from that one plant in the warmth of early August. I stood in the garden with 2 of them in my hands, actual tomatoes, alive and red and warm from the sun, and I said out loud to James, to the garden, to no one in particular. I didn't kill these ones. I ate one right there, standing in the garden in the August heat, the way James used to do. It tasted the way a tomato is supposed to taste, like something real, like something grown slowly in good soil by someone who paid attention. That's what I have. Everything we built, intact. The house we paid off together, sitting around me the same as it always has. The garden coming back. Sunday mornings, quiet now, different now, but still mine. Friday walks that I take alone and that are still, somehow, the same walk, the same neighborhood, the same light at the same angle in the same season, just one person walking instead of two. Vivian sent a note after everything was finalized, handwritten on her firm's stationery. It said, "You handled every part of this with more grace than most people could manage under far less difficult circumstances. James chose well." I read it in his chair, in our living room, in our house, in the late afternoon when the light comes through the front windows the way it always has, the way it will keep coming through as long as I am here to see it. I thought, yes, he did. And so did I. Diana thought she knew what James had and what she could take from him. She had spent years figuring it out, cataloging, planning, building, waiting for the right moment. What she never understood was that the thing she was really after, the thing she thought she could get by rearranging documents and cultivating an attorney and waiting patiently for grief to make me vulnerable, was never in any document. It was the 23 years. It was the pancakes and the walks and the language that had no words. It was the man who remembered every anniversary and laughed too loudly and sat with you when you were hurting and called himself lucky because he had me. You can't take that. You can't file it in a folder or contest it in court or rearrange it to put your name on it. It was already mine. It always will be.